Before potatoes took over Europe, people had plenty of other amazing crops to rely on. These lost foods survived harsh winters, grew in bad soil, and kept medieval folks full and strong. But over time, they were forgotten. Want to know which medieval superfoods might be even better than potatoes? Let's dig up medieval cookbook, and you'll find a surprising star. The humble parsnip. Before potatoes crossed the Atlantic in the 1500s, parsnips ruled European dinner tables for centuries. These pale, carrot-looking vegetables were absolutely everywhere in medieval kitchens. They were basically the medieval equivalent of French fries, except nobody was asking, "Would you like a parsnip with that?" at the local tavern. Medieval farmers grew parsnips by the wagon load for good reason. Unlike modern vegetables that need perfect conditions, parsnips thrived in the harsh European climate. They survived freezing winters that would kill most crops, actually becoming sweeter after frost hit them. They're the only food in history that improves when you forget about it. Unlike that leftover stew turning into a science experiment in the back of your fridge. The nutritional value made parsnips invaluable during harsh winters. One medium parsnip contains about 100 calories and is packed with fiber, vitamin C, and potassium. For medieval peasants who typically consumed between 2,000 and 3,000 calories daily, much from bread, parsnips provided essential nutrients when fresh food was scarce. In particularly harsh winters, parsnips could make up nearly a third of a peasant's diet. What made parsnips truly special was their versatility. Medieval cooks mashed them like we do potatoes, roasted them alongside meats, and added them to stews for thickness and flavor. Parsnips were so naturally sweet, they regularly appeared in medieval desserts. If a time-traveling medieval chef saw our grocery stores with aisles of cheap sugar, they'd faint faster than a knight in full armor on a summer day. Even more impressive was how parsnips grew in terrible soil. Medieval farming techniques weren't exactly advanced, and fields were often nutrient depleted. While other crops failed, parsnips pushed their long taproots deep into the ground, finding nutrients where other plants couldn't reach. Parsnips were basically the plant world's overachievers, thriving in dirt so bad other vegetables would file a complaint with medieval management. Parsnips were so important they appear in medieval taxation records. In many regions, farmers paid a portion of their parsnip harvest as tax to lords or the church. Nothing says important vegetable quite like the government wanting a cut of your root crop profits. Monasteries maintained huge parsnip fields to feed the poor during winter. Monks were basically running medieval food banks, except instead of canned goods, you'd get a sack of parsnips and a pamphlet about avoiding sin. The storage ability of parsnips was another medieval selling point. They could be left in the ground all winter, providing a ready food source when needed. Alternatively, they could be stored in cool, dry places for months, crucial before refrigeration existed. For medieval families, having a stockpile of parsnips meant survival through the hungry months of late winter when food stores ran low. So what happened? When potatoes arrived from the Americas, they offered higher yields and were slightly easier to store long term. Within a few generations, the parsnip went from dinnertime hero to forgotten vegetable. The parsnip essentially got vegetable ghosted by European farmers after a 1,000-year relationship. Talk about agricultural drama. Parsnips kept common folk alive through the harshest winters when other foods ran out. Medieval farmers didn't have time for complicated vegetable preparation. They had moats to dig and plagues to avoid. The parsnip's no-drama personality made it the perfect medieval fast food. Maybe we should take another look at what kept our ancestors fed long before potatoes arrived on European shores. Emmer wheat was one of the first crops humans ever domesticated, dating back roughly 10,000 years. By medieval times, it had already been feeding civilizations for millennia. Medieval farmers didn't just grow crops, they were continuing an agricultural tradition older than most castles, cathedrals, and royal family trees combined. What made Emmer wheat special was its incredible hardiness. It thrived in poor, rocky soil that would make modern wheat varieties fail. Despite wooden plows that barely scratched the earth's surface and fields that rarely got proper fertilization, Emmer wheat produced reliable harvests year after year. The nutritional profile of Emmer was impressive. It contains roughly 30% more protein than common wheat, plus higher levels of minerals like zinc, iron, and magnesium. Medieval bread made from Emmer wheat was dense, heavy, and often dark in color. If you dropped a medieval Emmer wheat loaf on your foot, you'd have a medieval medical emergency on your hands. This hearty bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, accounting for up to 70% of the average person's daily calories. Emmer wheat wasn't just important, it was vital enough to start riots when harvests failed. Historical records document bread riots, breaking out when grain supplies ran low or prices rose too high. Medieval folks took their carbs very seriously. Bread shortages caused more social upheaval than a modern internet outage. The grain was so valuable that it was often used as currency. Peasants frequently paid their taxes to lords in measures of grain rather than coins. Many monasteries and castles maintained grain stores vast enough to feed hundreds of people for months. So why did Emmer wheat disappear? Beginning in the late medieval period, common wheat gradually replaced Emmer because it was easier to process. Emmer has a tough husk that adheres tightly to the grain, requiring additional processing steps to remove. As medieval agriculture slowly industrialized, Emmer fell out of favor despite its nutritional and hardiness advantages. Medieval bread made from Emmer had a nutty, complex flavor that many food historians consider superior to modern wheat bread. Modern bread would seem suspiciously soft and bland to a medieval peasant. They'd probably assume you were trying to pass off cake as bread. Emmer wheat provided the daily sustenance that powered everything from cathedral construction to plowing fields. The dense, protein-rich bread gave medieval workers the energy to build the massive structures we still marvel at today. But bread alone wasn't enough to build those towering castles and cathedrals. Medieval workers needed something else. Ask a medieval farmer what kept workers strong enough to build castles, and they might point to a humble plant with broad leaves and stubby pods growing in neat rows near their cottage. Fava beans, also called broad beans, were medieval Europe's primary protein source long before modern meat production became commonplace. These unassuming legumes powered the muscles that built cathedrals, castles, and entire kingdoms. Unlike exotic spices or fine wines, fava beans weren't just for the wealthy. They appeared on tables from the poorest peasant hovels to royal banquet halls. Archaeological digs at medieval sites consistently find fava bean remains in latrines and garbage pits across all social classes. The fava bean was basically the great social equalizer of the Middle Ages, the one food that both kings and peasants had to expel eventually. Fava beans earned their place in medieval agriculture through sheer efficiency. They produced more protein per acre than almost any other crop available at the time. A single acre of fava beans could yield up to 1,500 pounds of dried beans, providing roughly 500 pounds of complete protein, enough to supply approximately 20 people with their annual protein needs. For comparison, raising enough cattle to produce the same amount of protein would require about 15 acres of grazing land. The cultivation of fava beans also improved the soil rather than depleting it. Like other legumes, fava beans have a special relationship with bacteria that live in nodules on their roots. These bacteria capture nitrogen from the air and convert it to a form plants can use, essentially acting as living fertilizer factories. Medieval farmers didn't understand the science, but they observed that crops planted after fava beans often grew better. Many farming manuals from the period recommended rotating fields between grains and beans to maintain soil health. Fava beans were so essential to food security that they appeared in medieval law codes. In parts of England, local ordinances required every household with a garden to dedicate a portion to growing fava beans. French monastic records show that bean seeds were distributed to peasant farmers as a form of charity during times of shortage. Being forced to grow beans by law sounds like a medieval form of punishment, but it was actually closer to government-mandated health insurance. The nutritional profile of fava beans made them ideal for the medieval diet. They contain about 26% protein by weight when dried, along with high levels of fiber, B vitamins, and minerals like iron, manganese, and copper. Just 1 cup of cooked fava beans provides nearly half the daily protein needs for an adult. For medieval people who couldn't afford meat regularly, fava beans were often the difference between proper nutrition and malnutrition. How did medieval cooks prepare fava beans? Almost every way imaginable. When young and tender, the entire pods could be eaten fresh. More commonly, the dried beans were soaked overnight, then boiled and added to soups, stews, and porridges. Wealthier households might season them with expensive imported spices, while humble peasant families made do with herbs grown in their gardens. Some recipes called for mashing cooked beans into a paste, then forming them into patties and frying them in lard or oil, essentially creating medieval veggie burgers. For the Lenten season, when church rules forbade meat consumption for 40 days, fava beans became even more important. During Lent, medieval monks living on beans and prayer might have experienced spiritual visions, or maybe just an unprecedented level of flatulence. Either way, bean consumption spiked dramatically during religious fasting periods. Not everything about fava beans was beneficial, however. Some people of Mediterranean descent carry a genetic trait called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, which can cause a dangerous reaction called favism when they eat fava beans. The condition was recognized even in medieval times, though not understood scientifically. Medical texts from the period warned that some people became ill after eating beans, but didn't know why. As meat production became more efficient in later centuries, fava beans gradually lost their prominence in European agriculture. Yet their legacy remains in traditional dishes across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In parts of Italy and Spain, dried fava beans are still ground into flour for bread making, continuing a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years. Fava beans supplied the crucial protein that built medieval muscles and kept workers strong enough to construct massive stone buildings that still stand today. But protein alone couldn't provide every nutrient needed by the medieval body. For that, communities turned to a fast-growing crop that could be planted during gaps in the growing season. Buckwheat is the medieval fast food that kept people fed when other crops needed more time. Despite its name, buckwheat isn't related to wheat at all. It's actually a seed related to rhubarb. Calling buckwheat a type of wheat is like calling a guinea pig a type of pork. Completely misleading, but stuck with us anyway. Buckwheat's superpower was its incredible growing speed. While wheat demanded months to mature, buckwheat could be harvested in just 10 to 12 weeks. Medieval farmers often planted it as an insurance policy. If the main grain harvest failed, buckwheat could still prevent winter famine. It was basically the medieval equivalent of ordering pizza when you burn dinner, the backup plan that always delivers. This humble plant thrived in poor, acidic soils where other crops struggled. It grew happily in rocky, sandy, or clay-heavy fields with minimal nutrients. It was essentially the "I'll eat whatever's in the refrigerator and won't complain" plant of the medieval farming world. Medieval cooks used buckwheat in porridge, pancakes, rustic bread, and even beer. The resulting dark beer was cheaper than barley beer, but still provided calories and nutrients. Medieval buckwheat beer probably tasted like liquid bread with a kick, but after a day of hauling stones for cathedral construction, nobody was posting one-star reviews about subtle flavor notes. The nutritional profile of buckwheat would make modern health influencers swoon. It contains all 8 essential amino acids, making it a complete protein source. Cup for cup, medieval buckwheat provided more protein than modern oatmeal, more antioxidants than many fruits, and fiber content that puts white bread to shame. If medieval buckwheat had an Instagram account today, it would be posting gym selfies and selling nutrition plans. Even more remarkable was buckwheat's ability to improve soil health. Its quick, dense growth suppressed weeds and prevented erosion. Its roots released compounds that made phosphorus more available to future plantings. Medieval farmers didn't understand the chemistry, but they knew fields where buckwheat had grown produced better yields the following season. Buckwheat was basically fertilizing the fields and fighting weeds while also feeding people, the medieval multitasker that makes our attempts at work-life balance look pathetic. So why did buckwheat fall from favor? As agriculture industrialized, crops were valued based on yield and storage stability. Wheat, corn, and rice all store longer and produce more calories per acre. Buckwheat was essentially fired from its job as a major crop for being too quirky and independent. Qualities that might make for an interesting coworker but don't fit with industrial agriculture. Today, buckwheat is sold at premium prices as a superfood, something that would baffle medieval farmers who saw it as humble emergency food. Medieval peasants would be shocked to see urban professionals paying $15 for a small bag of what was once considered the backup plan when better grains weren't available. You're paying how much for the emergency food? Did all the real food disappear? When winter set in and fresh foods became scarce, medieval communities relied on stored goods like buckwheat. But even in the harshest months, they found ways to supplement their diet with hardy greens that could withstand frost and snow. Good King Henry has triangular, arrow-shaped dark green leaves that somewhat resemble spinach. Unlike its modern cousins, it could survive brutal winter conditions. Frost that would kill most vegetables simply couldn't defeat it. Medieval winters were tough, but this plant was tougher, like that one neighbor who wears shorts year-round no matter the weather. The name Good King Henry likely comes from a corruption of Guter Heinrich in German, referring to household spirits believed to help around the home, appropriate for a plant that seemed to magically appear just when people needed it most. What made Good King Henry truly special was its versatility. Young shoots could be harvested in early spring and prepared like asparagus. The tender leaves were used in soups, stews, and medieval stuffing mixtures. The seeds could even be ground and added to flour for bread in times of extreme shortage. Nutritionally, Good King Henry was a powerhouse. Rich in vitamins A and C, it provided crucial nutrients when scurvy threatened winter health. The leaves contained significant amounts of iron, calcium, and potassium, all vital minerals often lacking in the limited winter diet of bread and preserved meats. Medieval households didn't grow Good King Henry in organized rows like modern vegetables. Instead, they encouraged it to grow in semi-wild patches near their homes. They would protect patches of the plant and scatter its seeds in convenient locations where it could thrive with minimal care. It was essentially medieval meal prep. Set it up once and then forget about it until dinner time. Once established, Good King Henry would return year after year without replanting. Some patches are known to have survived for decades, feeding multiple generations of the same family. Even in years when annual crops failed due to bad weather or political unrest, Good King Henry would still appear, reliable as the seasons themselves. Despite its medieval popularity, Good King Henry almost completely disappeared from our diets by the 19th century. As farming became more commercialized, vegetables were increasingly valued for their yield, storage ability, and uniformity, qualities this wild-hearted plant lacked. Good King Henry essentially got pushed out of agriculture by vegetables with better marketing teams and more commercial appeal. Modern consumers would likely walk past a patch of Good King Henry to get to the organic spinach display at Whole Foods, never realizing they're ignoring a vegetable that kept their ancestors alive through countless harsh winters. While hardy greens like Good King Henry helped medieval people survive the lean months, they knew that survival required more than just vegetables. Every medieval village relied on another ancient crop. If you had to pick one crop that defined medieval life from sunup to sundown, barley would win the prize. This humble grain wasn't just food, it was breakfast, dinner, and the beverage that washed it all down. Barley was everywhere in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence consistently shows it as the most commonly found grain, often accounting for over 50% of all grain remains. Unlike fancier grains, barley grew well in poor soil and harsh climates, making it ideal for the less-than-perfect farming conditions of medieval Europe. The versatility of barley made it particularly valuable. The grain could be ground into flour for bread, especially for the lower classes. It could also be boiled whole into a porridge that served as a staple breakfast across Europe. But barley's most significant role in medieval society was as the primary ingredient in beer, the daily beverage of choice for almost everyone. Water sources were often contaminated, while the brewing process made beer safer to drink. Medieval folks weren't drinking beer all day because they wanted to party. They were just trying not to get sick from the water, which is probably the most responsible reason to be slightly buzzed at breakfast ever. The average medieval adult consumed between 1 and 5 liters of beer daily. Manor records from 13th century England show that brewing used up to 30% of the total barley harvest in some areas. The brewing process kills harmful bacteria, and the resulting beer provides calories, nutrients, and safe hydration. Barley also played a crucial role in feeding medieval armies. Military campaigns relied on barley because it was lightweight when dried, could be quickly turned into porridge in field conditions, and traveled well without spoiling. The famous hardtack biscuits that sustained armies were often made with barley flour. They were so tough that medieval soldiers probably had better dental insurance than we do today. Oh wait, they didn't have any, which explains a lot about medieval teeth. The nutritional profile of barley made it ideal for sustaining hardworking medieval bodies. 1 pound of barley contains approximately 1,650 calories and 50 grams of protein, roughly half the daily caloric needs for a medieval laborer working in the fields or constructing a cathedral. Barley even influenced medieval social structures. Many tenant farmers paid their rent in barley, and feudal obligations often included helping with the barley harvest on the lord's land. Having a good barley harvest could literally determine whether a family would survive until the next year or face starvation. Interestingly, barley brewing created opportunities for women in medieval society. Brewing was often considered women's work in many parts of Europe until the later Middle Ages. Female brewers, known as alewives, produced beer in their homes and sold the surplus. These medieval businesswomen were basically running the equivalent of craft breweries long before bearded guys in flannel shirts made it trendy. Surprisingly, many food experts and farmers are beginning to look back at these resilient crops with renewed interest, especially as we face challenges our medieval ancestors would have understood all too well. These forgotten medieval crops aren't just historical curiosities, they might be exactly what modern agriculture needs. As climate change brings unpredictable weather and soils struggle to support intensive farming, these ancient varieties offer surprising solutions. Medieval crops like fava beans naturally fixed nitrogen in the soil, while buckwheat made phosphorus more available and suppressed weeds. Emmer wheat thrived in poor soil that would make modern varieties fail. Parsnips survived harsh winters and improved in flavor after frost. As weather patterns become more extreme, these hardy crops offer reliability when modern varieties might fail. The nutritional profiles also deserve another look. Ancient varieties like Emmer contain more protein and minerals than modern wheat. Buckwheat offers complete protein and better blood sugar control. These medieval crops were basically superfoods before influencers started charging $20 for smoothies made with them. Small-scale farmers and chefs are already leading the revival. Emmer wheat has reappeared as farro on restaurant menus. Craft brewers are experimenting with historical grain varieties. Food security experts point to these forgotten crops as important tools for agricultural diversity. Medieval peasants would probably be confused to see their survival foods rebranded as luxury items, but they definitely appreciate the irony of rich people suddenly discovering what kept poor folks alive for centuries. Maybe it's time we learned from the practical wisdom of medieval farmers who managed to feed populations without fossil fuels, chemical fertilizers, or global supply chains.